The thunder rolled across the darkened sky as Beatrice Lawson stood before the grave of her husband, her heart as cold and empty as the freshly dug earth that now separated them forever. Rain pelted her black mourning dress, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't care if the heavens themselves sought to drown her in their fury. 3 months had passed since Thomas had been gunned down in the dusty main street of Eureka, California, and still she came here daily, searching for answers that would never come. "Where were you?" she whispered, her eyes raised not to the headstone but to the storm clouds above. "Where were you when he needed you most?" The year was 1878, and Beatrice Lawson, once a woman of unshakable faith, had found herself utterly abandoned by the God she had trusted all her life. The mud clung to the hem of her dress as she finally turned away, 27 years old, and a widow in a town that had little use for a woman alone. As she made her way back toward the town proper, she didn't notice the stranger watching her from beneath the brim of his worn leather hat, his eyes following her silhouette against the stormy horizon. Franklin Pierce had ridden into Eureka just that morning, drawn to the small mining town by rumors of good work and even better pay. What he hadn't expected was to be so immediately captivated by a woman draped in mourning clothes, her face a portrait of desolation that mirrored the turbulent skies. Beatrice made her way back to the small general store her husband had left her. It was all she had now, a struggling business in a town where most folks preferred to patronize establishments run by men. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of leather goods, coffee beans, and tobacco offering no comfort as it once had. The bell above the door jingled as she closed it behind her, shutting out the rain and the world. She removed her soaked bonnet and hung it on the rack, water dripping onto the wooden floor. The silence of the empty store pressed in around her. Thomas had always been the one to greet customers, to laugh and swap stories. She had worked the books, ordered inventory, and kept everything organized. Now she had to do it all, and the weight of it crushed her. She moved behind the counter, checking the ledgers. The numbers were dismal. If business didn't improve soon, she'd have to sell. The thought of losing this last connection to Thomas made her throat tighten with unshed tears. The bell above the door jingled again, startling her. She looked up to see a tall man silhouetted against the gray light from outside. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at his temples. His face was weathered but not old, perhaps 35, with clear blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Mighty fierce weather out there." Beatrice straightened her spine and slipped on the mask of polite shopkeeper she'd been perfecting these past months. "Indeed it is. How may I help you, sir?" "Name's Franklin Pierce. Just rode into town this morning." He approached the counter, his spurs making a gentle jingling sound against the wooden floor. "Looking to stock up on a few supplies." "Of course, Mr. Pierce. What do you need?" He listed off several basic items: coffee, tobacco, ammunition for his Colt revolver, a new shirt, and some jerky for the trail. As Beatrice moved around the store collecting his purchases, she could feel his eyes on her, not in the predatory way some men looked at a woman alone, but with a curious intensity that made her uncomfortable nonetheless. "You run this place by yourself?" he asked as she placed his items on the counter. "I do now," she replied curtly, tallying up the cost. "That'll be $4.17. He handed her a $5 gold piece. "Keep the change, Mrs. Lawson, Beatrice Lawson." She pushed the coin back toward him. "And I don't accept charity, Mr. Pierce, not even disguised as generosity." A slight smile touched his lips as he took back the coin and waited for his proper change. "No offense meant, Mrs. Lawson, just trying to be neighborly. Are you planning to be a neighbor then?" she asked, handing him his coins. "Or are you just passing through?" "That depends," he said, gathering his purchases. "I hear there's work to be had around these parts. I'm a man who knows horses, cattle, and how to use a gun when needed. Eureka's a mining town, Mr. Pierce. Gold brought most folks here, though there's ranching in the valleys. If you're looking for work, try the Crescent City stage line. They're always needing guards for the runs through the mountains." He nodded, considering her words. "I appreciate the advice." He put his hat back on and tipped the brim to her. "You'll be seeing me again, Mrs. Lawson." "The general store is open Monday through Saturday," she replied stiffly. As the door closed behind him, Beatrice let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. There was something about Franklin Pierce that unnerved her, not in a threatening way, but in a manner that made her feel seen for the first time in months. It was an unwelcome sensation. She'd grown accustomed to her invisibility, to moving through the world like a ghost. Being noticed meant being vulnerable, and she couldn't afford that. Not anymore. The rain continued its assault on Eureka for 3 more days. Franklin secured a room at the Eureka Hotel and spent his time exploring the town, making acquaintances at the saloon, and asking casual questions about work and the local inhabitants. He learned that Beatrice Lawson's husband had been shot in a confrontation with a drunk miner who'd claimed Thomas had cheated him on the price of a saddle. The miner had fled town immediately after, and no one had seen him since. On the 4th day, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Franklin made his way to the stage office and secured a position as a guard for the run to Crescent City. It wasn't ideal work, but it would keep him in Eureka, and for reasons he wasn't entirely clear on himself, that had become important. That afternoon, he found himself once more at Lawson's general store. The bell announced his arrival, and Beatrice looked up from where she was arranging a display of canned goods. "Mr. Pierce," she acknowledged with a nod. "What can I help you with today?" "Got myself hired on with the stage line," he said, moving toward the counter. "Need a few more things for the road. It's a 3-day round trip, I'm told." "Congratulations," she said, her tone non-committal. "What supplies do you need?" As she gathered his requests, Franklin noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her mourning dress hung a bit too loose on her frame. He'd heard in town that she rarely accepted help, that she'd rebuffed the church ladies who tried to bring her meals after the funeral, that she'd stopped attending Sunday services altogether. "Heard there was some trouble here a few months back," he said casually, as she placed a tin of coffee on the counter. Her hands stilled momentarily before continuing their work. "Eureka's a mining town, Mr. Pierce. Trouble is as common as dust. I meant about your husband." "I'm sorry for your loss." Her eyes flashed up to his, a spark of anger replacing the dull emptiness he'd seen before. "My husband isn't a topic for casual conversation, especially not with strangers. No disrespect intended," he said quietly. "Just wanted you to know that if you ever need any help around here lifting heavy things, fixing what's broken, I'm available. As I told you before, Mr. Pierce, I don't accept charity. And I don't offer charity, Mrs. Lawson. I offer fair exchange. Services rendered for payment given, whether that's money or a hot meal or just the knowledge that I've been useful." He gathered his purchases. "First stage run is tomorrow. I'll be back in town in 3 days." He paid for his items and left, the bell signaling his departure with the same cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the tension in the store. Beatrice watched him go, her heart beating oddly fast. She didn't want Franklin Pierce's help or his sympathy. She didn't want him noticing the dark circles under her eyes or how her dress hung loose, because she couldn't summon the appetite to eat properly. She didn't want him or anyone else in Eureka to see how she was falling apart day by day. That night, as she closed up the store and prepared to walk the short distance to her small house behind the building, she noticed a loose board on the front step. Thomas had meant to fix it before he couldn't anymore. She'd been stepping over it for months now, but tonight it seemed to mock her, another reminder of all that she'd lost. With a sudden surge of anger, she kicked at the board, only to lose her balance and tumble forward. She threw out her hands to catch herself, wincing as splinters dug into her palms. For a moment, she stayed there on her hands and knees in the dirt, hot tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "God damn it all," she whispered, the blasphemy unfamiliar on her tongue but somehow fitting for the hollow ache in her chest. She picked herself up, brushed off her dress and continued home, leaving the broken step for another day. The next morning, Franklin departed with the stage, rifle at the ready as they headed west toward the coastal mountains and Crescent City beyond. The work was straightforward enough: keep watch for road agents, protect the mail and any valuables being transported. The company had been suffering losses on this route for months, though no one could say for certain if it was organized bandits or just opportunistic thieves. As the stage rattled along the rough mountain road, Franklin's thoughts kept returning to Beatrice Lawson. There was something about her that called to him, a strength beneath her grief that intrigued him. He'd known plenty of women over his years drifting across the West, but none had affected him quite like this widow with her fierce independence and wounded eyes. The journey to Crescent City was uneventful, but on the return trip, as they wound through a narrow pass, shots rang out from the rocks above. Franklin reacted instantly, returning fire while shouting for the driver to whip up the horses. A bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning trail across his flesh, but he kept firing, determined to get the stage through the ambush. They made it past the danger point with no casualties save for his minor wound and a passenger's hat that had been shot clean off his head. When they finally rolled into Eureka 3 days after departing, Franklin's arm was bound with a makeshift bandage, and his thoughts were on a hot bath, a whiskey, and perhaps a certain widow shopkeeper who probably wouldn't give him the time of day. But first, he needed proper medical attention. The local doctor, a man named Wilson, cleaned and stitched his wound, commenting that he was lucky it hadn't been worse. "You stage guards earn your pay," the doctor said as he tied off the final stitch. "That's the 3rd ambush in as many months. Sheriff's been trying to track down whoever's behind it, but those mountains are full of hiding places." "Any leads?" Franklin asked, wincing as he pulled his shirt back on over the bandaged arm. "Some think it might be the Dalton gang. Others say it's local boys gone bad." Sheriff leans toward the latter theory. Wilson handed Franklin a small bottle. "Laudanum for the pain. Use it sparingly." Franklin thanked him, paid his fee, and headed back to the hotel. As he passed Lawson's general store, he noticed the broken step had been fixed, the old board replaced with new lumber that still smelled of fresh sawing. Curious, he pushed open the door, the bell announcing his arrival. Beatrice was helping an elderly woman select fabric, but her eyes darted to him as he entered. He nodded in greeting and moved to examine some tools displayed on a shelf, waiting for her to finish with her customer. When the old woman finally departed with her purchases, Beatrice turned to him, her eyes immediately going to his bandaged arm visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "You're injured," she stated, concern briefly crossing her face before her usual reserve returned. "Hazard of the job," he replied with a shrug that he immediately regretted as pain shot through his arm. Nothing serious. Doc Wilson patched me up. The stage was attacked, just outside of French Gulch on the return journey. Nobody killed, thankfully. He gestured toward the front of the store. I see you got your step fixed. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Mr. Miller from the lumberyard did it yesterday. I finally got around to asking him. Franklin nodded, though he'd already heard in town that old man Miller hadn't been near the general store in weeks. Someone else had fixed that step, and from the fresh cut of the wood and the clean work, he had his suspicions about who it might have been. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Pierce?" Beatrice asked, clearly wanting to move past any personal conversation. "Just wanted to restock after the journey. Coffee, mainly. Seems I go through it faster than expected." As she measured out the coffee beans, he noticed a small painting hanging behind the counter, a landscape of a green valley with mountains in the distance. Nothing particularly remarkable except for the signature in the corner, B. Lawson. "You're an artist," he said, nodding toward the painting. She glanced back at it, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I used to paint, before. It's good. Reminds me of the Willamette Valley up in Oregon Territory." "That's what it is," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "My family moved here from Salem when I was 16. I painted that from memory." "You captured it well." He paid for his coffee. "You ought to paint more." "I haven't touched a brush since Thomas died," she said, the words escaping before she seemed to realize she was sharing something personal. Her face closed off again. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Pierce?" "Not today, Mrs. Lawson. Thank you." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "By the way, whoever fixed your step did a fine job. Solid craftsmanship." He left before she could respond, but not before seeing the flicker of confusion in her eyes. That evening, as Beatrice closed the store and walked around to her small house behind it, she noticed that the loose hinge on her back gate had also been repaired. She stood there for a long moment, running her fingers over the smooth metal that no longer squeaked when the gate moved. Thomas had always meant to fix it, just like the step, just like the leak in the store roof that mysteriously no longer dripped when it rained, just like the shelf that had been reinforced without her knowledge. She knew then that it wasn't Mr. Miller who had fixed her step. It was Franklin Pierce. Somehow, he was slipping in and making these repairs without her seeing him, without giving her the chance to refuse his help. Part of her was annoyed at his presumption. Another part, a part she tried to ignore, was touched by the gesture, not just the help itself, but the way he offered it without expecting recognition or thanks. The next day, Franklin was back at the store, this time to purchase some writing paper and a pencil. "Planning to write a letter?" Beatrice asked as she wrapped his purchase in brown paper. "Thought I might try my hand at sketching," he said. "Seeing your painting yesterday reminded me that I used to enjoy drawing when I was younger." "You're a man of many talents, it seems," she said, a hint of dryness in her tone. "Riding shotgun, fixing broken steps, and now art." He had the good grace to look slightly abashed. "Ah. You figured that out, did you? And the gate, and the roof, and the shelf," she added, pushing his purchase across the counter. "Mr. Pierce, while I appreciate the gesture, I didn't ask for your help." "No, you didn't," he agreed. "And if you want me to stop, I will. But I noticed things that needed fixing, and I had the time and skills to fix them. No strings attached, Mrs. Lawson. No expectations." She studied him for a moment, trying to discern his true motives. Men didn't just help women without wanting something in return, at least. That had been her experience since Thomas died. The preacher wanted her back in church. The banker wanted her to sell the store. The single men of Eureka wanted her to consider remarrying, preferably to them. "Why?" she asked finally. Why would you do this for a stranger? Franklin considered his answer carefully. Because I've been alone in strange towns before. I know what it's like to face each day wondering if this is all there is now. And sometimes, a fixed step or a repaired hinge can make that day a little easier to face. His honesty caught her off guard. There was no pity in his eyes, just a simple understanding that she found both unsettling and oddly comforting. I lost my wife and daughter to cholera in '72, he continued quietly. I was away working when it happened, came home to 2 fresh graves and a house full of ghosts. Beatrice's throat tightened. I'm sorry. As am I for your loss, Mrs. Lawson. He picked up his wrapped parcel. I won't fix anything else without asking first. You have my word. As he turned to leave, Beatrice found herself speaking without having planned to. The shutter on the west window upstairs is loose. It bangs something awful when the wind picks up. Franklin paused, looking back at her with a small smile. I could take a look at it tomorrow if that would be agreeable. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. After he left, she stood motionless behind the counter, wondering what had possessed her to accept his help after months of fiercely refusing everyone else's. True to his word, Franklin appeared the next morning with a small tool kit. Beatrice led him upstairs to the storage room where the offending shutter had been keeping her awake on windy nights. As he worked, she found herself hovering nearby, watching his hands as they competently manipulated the tools. How long have you been in Eureka? He asked as he tightened a screw. Almost 4 years now. Thomas and I came here from Sacramento after the war. He'd fought for the Union, came back changed like so many did. Wanted to start fresh somewhere new. Franklin nodded, understanding in his eyes. The war changed a lot of men, changed the country too. Did you fight? Confederate cavalry, he admitted. Not something I advertise much in California. The war was lost before I even understood what we were really fighting for, or against, more accurately. Beatrice appreciated his honesty. So many former Confederates she'd met over the years still clung to the idea that the South would rise again, or that they had been fighting for some noble cause rather than the right to own other human beings. Thomas never held grudges against former Confederates, she said. He said most were just boys following orders, same as him. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He was kind and fair, and her voice caught the grief suddenly fresh again. He didn't deserve to die over the price of a saddle. Franklin paused in his work, turning to face her fully. No, he didn't. Few of us get what we deserve in this life, good or bad. Is that supposed to be comforting? She asked, a hint of bitterness in her voice. No, he replied honestly. Just true. He finished fixing the shutter and tested it, the window now opening and closing smoothly. There, that should hold even in a gale. Thank you, Beatrice said, genuinely grateful. What do I owe you for your time? Franklin considered for a moment. Dinner, he said finally. Not as payment, but as company. The hotel dining room serves a decent steak on Thursdays. Beatrice stiffened, immediately regretting the momentary connection she'd felt. Mr. Pierce, I'm a widow in mourning. It wouldn't be proper for me to dine with a single man. With all due respect, Mrs. Lawson, I'm not asking to court you. I'm suggesting a meal between 2 people who could both use some company. He gathered his tools. But I understand if you're not comfortable with the idea. He headed for the stairs, and Beatrice found herself torn between relief that he hadn't pressed the issue and an unexpected disappointment. Mr. Pierce, she called after him. He paused, looking back at her. I can't dine with you at the hotel, but I could offer you supper here tomorrow evening. As thanks for the repairs. A smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and making them crinkle at the corners. I'd be honored, Mrs. Lawson. What time shall I arrive? 6 o'clock, she said, already wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "I'll be here at 6 then." He tipped his hat and descended the stairs, leaving Beatrice standing in the storage room with her heart beating faster than it had in months. The next day, Beatrice found herself unusually distracted. Twice she gave customers incorrect change, and once she knocked over an entire display of canned peaches while dusting. As closing time approached, she grew increasingly nervous about the evening ahead. It wasn't a romantic supper, she reminded herself. It was simply a gesture of thanks to a man who had shown her kindness without expectation. Still, she found herself putting more care into preparing the meal than she had for any food she'd made since Thomas died. She roasted a chicken, made fresh biscuits, and even opened a jar of the blackberry preserves she'd put up last summer. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at her back door. Franklin stood there, his hair still damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt with his usual suspenders. In one hand he held a small bunch of wildflowers and in the other, a bottle of wine. "Evening, Mrs. Lawson," he said, handing her the flowers. "These were growing by the creek just outside of town. Thought they might brighten your table." "Thank you," she said, accepting them with a small smile. "Please come in." Her house was modest but neat, with simple furniture and few decorations save for her own paintings that hung on the walls. The dining table was already set for two, the good plates that she rarely used gleaming in the lamplight. "Something smells wonderful," Franklin commented as he set the wine on the table. "Roast chicken," Beatrice replied, moving to put the flowers in a small jar of water. "Nothing fancy." After weeks of trail food and hotel fare, a home-cooked meal is fancy enough for me. They sat down to eat, an awkward silence falling between them at first. Beatrice hadn't entertained anyone since the funeral, and she found herself struggling to remember the rules of polite dinner conversation. Franklin seemed to sense her discomfort. "Tell me about your painting," he said, nodding toward a small landscape hanging on the opposite wall. "Is that local?" Grateful for the neutral topic, Beatrice glanced at the painting in question. "Yes, it's the view from Shasta Butte, looking back toward Irica. Thomas and I climbed up there on our first anniversary. It's beautiful work. You have a real talent, thank you," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I used to paint regularly, especially landscapes. There's so much natural beauty in this part of California." "Why did you stop?" he asked gently, Beatrice's hand stilled on her cutlery. "After Thomas died, nothing felt worth doing anymore, painting included." Franklin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "When my wife and daughter died, I couldn't bear to stay in our house. Sold everything except what would fit in my saddlebags and just rode away, didn't stop moving for almost 2 years. "What made you finally slow down?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Exhaustion, partly. You can only run so far before you realize the grief comes with you no matter where you go." He took a sip of his wine. "And then one day, I was sitting by a campfire in Arizona territory, and I found myself whittling a little wooden horse, just like the ones I used to make for my daughter. Cried like a baby when I realized what I was doing, but it felt like the first real thing I'd done since losing them." Beatrice felt a lump form in her throat. "Does it ever stop hurting?" "No," Franklin said honestly, "but it changes. Becomes something you can carry rather than something that crushes you." He met her eyes across the table. "I'm not going to tell you it all happens for a reason or that time heals all wounds. Those are pretty lies people tell because the truth is harder to bear." "And what is the truth, Mr. Pierce?" "That life can be cruel and random. That good people die while the wicked prosper. That sometimes there is no justice or divine plan." He paused. "But also that beauty still exists alongside the pain." That connections with others are what make the suffering bearable. That we can choose to keep living, really living, even after devastating loss. His words resonated with something deep inside her, acknowledging the anger and disillusionment she'd been feeling without trying to dismiss or minimize it. "I stopped believing, she said quietly. "After Thomas died. All those years of faith, of prayer, of trusting in God's plan. And where did it lead? To my husband bleeding to death in the dirt over a $3 dispute. Franklin didn't immediately jump to defend God or offer platitudes about mysterious ways as the preacher had done. Instead, he simply nodded. I questioned a lot myself after losing my family. Still do, some days. How do you go on believing after something like that? I don't know that I do, not in the same way as before, he admitted. But I've found that I don't need all the answers to keep putting one foot in front of the other. To appreciate a sunset or help a neighbor or enjoy a fine meal with good company." He raised his glass slightly toward her. "Some days, that has to be enough." The honesty of his response moved her more than any sermon could have. They continued talking as they ate, the conversation flowing more easily now. Franklin told her stories of his travels across the West, and she shared memories of her childhood in Oregon. Neither mentioned religion again, but Beatrice felt something shift inside her, as if a door that had been firmly shut was now cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. As the evening drew to a close, Franklin helped her clear the table, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked side by side. Each brief contact sent a fluttering sensation through Beatrice's stomach, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her early days with Thomas. At the door, Franklin paused. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Lawson. Best I've had in years." "Thank you for fixing my shutter," she replied. "And for the conversation." He smiled, his eyes warm in the lamplight. "I'm riding shotgun on the stage again tomorrow, but I'll be back in 3 days. Perhaps I could call on you then. There's a loose board on your back porch that looks like it could use some attention." A small smile tugged at her lips. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Pierce." "Franklin," he said. "After sharing a meal and our stories, I think we can dispense with the formalities, don't you?" She hesitated only briefly. "Franklin, then, and you may call me Beatrice." "Good night, Beatrice," he said softly, tipping his hat before disappearing into the darkness. She closed the door behind him, leaning against it as her heart raced inexplicably. What was she doing? Thomas had been dead less than 4 months, and here she was inviting another man to dinner, smiling at him, feeling something. The guilt crashed over her in a wave, followed immediately by confusion and then a flicker of defiance. Thomas was gone. Nothing would bring him back. And for the first time since his death, she had experienced a few hours where grief wasn't her primary emotion. Was that so wrong? She moved around the small house, extinguishing lamps and preparing for bed. As she passed her painting supplies, untouched since the funeral, she paused. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up a brush, running her fingers over the bristles. Not tonight, she decided, setting it back down. But perhaps soon. The next day, Franklin departed with the stage as planned. Beatrice found herself watching from the store window as the coach rattled down the main street of Eureka, dust billowing behind it. She told herself she was merely taking a moment's break from inventory, not specifically waiting to catch a glimpse of the man riding shotgun. The 3 days of Franklin's absence passed more slowly than Beatrice expected. She found herself looking up eagerly whenever the bell above the door jingled, only to feel a stab of disappointment when it wasn't him. This reaction troubled her. She barely knew the man, after all. And yet their dinner conversation had awakened something in her that she thought had died with Thomas, a desire for connection, for understanding. On the afternoon Franklin was due to return, Beatrice closed the store early and went home to change her dress. She had been wearing the same 3 black morning dresses in rotation since the funeral, but today she reached for a gray dress she hadn't worn in months. It was still somber enough to be respectful of her widowed state, but the lighter color and the subtle embroidery around the collar made it feel like a tentative step toward rejoining the world. She was just pinning up her hair when she heard a commotion outside, raised voices, the pounding of hooves, and then a woman's scream. Rushing to the window, she saw a crowd gathering near the stage office. Her heart lurched as she thought of Franklin, and without pausing to grab a shawl, she hurried outside. The scene that greeted her was chaotic. The stage had arrived, but it was riddled with bullet holes. The driver was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and passengers were being helped down, their faces pale with shock. "What happened?" Beatrice asked Mrs. Gardner, the baker's wife, who was standing nearby. "Ambush," the woman replied, her eyes wide. "Bad one from what I hear. 2 passengers wounded and the guard." Beatrice's blood ran cold. "The guard, Franklin Pierce," Mrs. Gardner nodded grimly. "Shot twice. They've taken him to Doc Wilson's." Without another word, Beatrice gathered her skirts and ran toward the doctor's office, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She burst through the door to find the waiting room already crowded with people seeking news or treatment for minor injuries from the attack. Dr. Wilson's wife, who assisted him in his practice, looked up from bandaging a passenger's arm. "Mrs. Lawson, are you hurt?" "No, I heard about Mr. Pierce. Is he?" "Alive, but in a bad way," Mrs. Wilson replied, her voice low. "The doctor's with him now. 1 bullet in the shoulder, another grazed his head. He's lost a lot of blood." "Can I see him?" Mrs. Wilson looked surprised at the request. "He's not conscious, Mrs. Lawson, and the doctor's still working." "Perhaps tomorrow, please," Beatrice interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "I just need to know he's going to be all right." Something in her expression must have conveyed the depth of her concern, because Mrs. Wilson's face softened. "Wait here. I'll ask my husband if you can look in briefly once he's finished." The next hour was the longest of Beatrice's life since the day Thomas was shot. She sat rigidly in a chair in the waiting room, ignoring the curious glances from townspeople who were surprised to see the reclusive widow Lawson so obviously concerned about the stage guard. Finally, Dr. Wilson emerged from the back room, wiping blood from his hands with a cloth. His eyes scanned the waiting room until they found Beatrice. He motioned her forward. "He's stable for now," the doctor said quietly. "The shoulder wound is serious, but clean. The bullet went straight through. The head wound looks worse than it is, just a deep graze along the temple. He'll have quite a scar, but his skull is intact." "Will he recover?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If infection doesn't set in, yes, but he'll need careful nursing for at least a week, probably longer." The doctor hesitated. "The hotel's not a good place for that kind of recovery. I'd keep him here, but with this stage attack, I've got more patients than beds." "He can stay with me," Beatrice heard herself say, the words out before she'd fully formed the thought. "I have a spare room. I can look after him." Dr. Wilson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mrs. Lawson, while that's very generous, I'm not sure it would be appropriate. A single man staying in a widow's home. He saved my husband's life once before he died." Beatrice lied smoothly, surprising herself. "I owe him this. And I don't particularly care what people think is appropriate." The doctor studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're certain, it would be the best thing for him medically speaking. He shouldn't be moved tonight, but perhaps tomorrow if he's stronger." "I'll make the preparations," Beatrice said. "May I see him now?" Dr. Wilson led her to a small room at the back of his office. Franklin lay on a narrow bed, his upper body bare except for the bandages wrapped around his left shoulder and head. His face was pale beneath his tan, making the dark stubble on his jaw stand out in stark relief. But his chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and for that, Beatrice was profoundly grateful. She approached the bed quietly, resisting the urge to reach out and touch his hand. It struck her then, the absurdity of her reaction. She barely knew this man, and yet the thought of losing him had sent her running through town in a panic. "He's heavily sedated," Dr. Wilson said from the doorway. "He won't wake until morning, most likely." Beatrice nodded, her eyes still on Franklin's face. "I'll return tomorrow with a wagon to transport him to my home. What supplies will I need for his care?" As the doctor listed bandages, medicines, and instructions, Beatrice listened carefully, committing everything to memory. She had nursed Thomas through a bout of pneumonia 2 winters ago. She could certainly manage bullet wounds. What she wasn't sure she could manage were the feelings stirring inside her, feelings that had no right to exist so soon after her husband's death. Feelings for a man she had shared exactly 1 meal with. Yet there they were, undeniable and terrifying in their intensity. The next morning, Beatrice arrived at Dr. Wilson's office with a wagon borrowed from Mr. Jenkins at the livery stable. She had spent half the night preparing the spare room in her house, which had been used primarily for storage since Thomas died. She'd cleared out the boxes, aired the mattress, and put fresh linens on the bed. Franklin was awake when she arrived, though groggy from the medication and blood loss. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her. "Beatrice," he murmured, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to take you home," she said, approaching his bedside. "You need proper care while you recover, and the doctor has too many patients." Confusion clouded his features. "Home? Your home?" "I have a spare room," she explained, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his intense gaze. "It's the least I can do after all the repairs you've done for me." A small smile tugged at his lips despite his obvious pain. "Hardly seems like a fair exchange. A few fixed shutters for nursing a gunshot wound." "Well, the offer stands, unless you'd prefer to stay at the hotel." He shook his head slightly, then winced at the movement. "No, I'm grateful for your kindness, but people will talk, Beatrice." "A widow taking in a single man, let them talk," she interrupted, a hint of her old spirit flashing in her eyes. "I stopped caring what this town thinks of me the day they buried my husband and went back to business as usual." Dr. Wilson entered then, carrying fresh bandages. "Ah, Mrs. Lawson, you're here. Good. Mr. Pierce is stable enough to be moved, though we'll need to be careful with that shoulder." With the doctor's help, they managed to get Franklin dressed in a clean shirt slit down the left side to accommodate his bandaged shoulder and into the wagon. Beatrice had prepared a pallet of blankets to cushion the ride, but every jolt of the wagon over Eureka's rutted streets drew a barely suppressed groan from Franklin. By the time they reached her house, his face was ashen with pain, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool spring air. Getting him inside and settled in the spare room took all 3 of them, Beatrice, Dr. Wilson, and Mr. Jenkins, who had insisted on coming along to help. Once Franklin was finally lying in the clean bed, Dr. Wilson administered more laudanum for the pain and gave Beatrice final instructions for his care. Change the bandages twice daily. Watch for any signs of infection, increased redness, swelling, heat around the wounds, or fever. He'll need to keep the shoulder immobilized for at least a week, preferably 2. Clear broth and soft foods at first, then regular meals as his appetite returns. The doctor handed her 2 small bottles. Laudanum for the pain, use sparingly, and this tincture of willow bark for fever if it develops. After the men left, Beatrice sat in a chair beside Franklin's bed, watching as the laudanum took effect and his features relaxed into sleep. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the strand of silver threading through his sandy brown hair at the temple. His face in repose looked younger, less guarded. She found herself wondering about the life he had led before coming to Eureka. He had told her about losing his wife and daughter, about his years of wandering afterward, but there was clearly much more to his story. What had brought him specifically to this small mining town in Northern California? Was he truly just looking for work, or was there something or someone he was running from? Franklin stirred in his sleep, his brow furrowing as if in pain or troubled dreams. Without thinking, Beatrice reached out and gently smoothed a lock of hair back from his forehead. The simple human contact seemed to soothe him, and his face relaxed once more. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, drawing her hand back. But she knew deep down that whatever was happening between them had started the moment he walked into her store with rain dripping from his hat brim. She just wasn't ready to name it yet. The next few days fell into a routine. Beatrice would open the store in the morning, checking on Franklin before she left and during her midday break. Mrs. Wilson came by daily to help with changing the bandages, a task Beatrice wasn't yet confident doing on her own, especially for the shoulder wound that required Franklin to be sitting up. By the fourth day, Franklin was strong enough to stay awake for longer periods and to feed himself the soup and bread Beatrice brought him. They talked during these meals nothing too deep or personal, just everyday conversation about the town, the weather, books they had read. On the fifth day, as Beatrice was clearing away his lunch tray, Franklin caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his blue eyes serious. "Not just for the meal or the bed, but for taking in a virtual stranger. It's a kindness I won't forget." The warmth of his hand around hers sent a flutter through her stomach. "You're hardly a stranger anymore," she replied softly. "No, I suppose not." His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. "Still, most widows wouldn't risk their reputation this way." "Most widows haven't lost their faith in everything they once believed in," she said, the words coming unbidden. "After Thomas died, I stopped caring about appearances or propriety or what God might think of my actions. None of it seemed to matter anymore." Franklin held her gaze steadily. "And now? Does any of it matter now?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond the surface words. Beatrice found herself unable to look away from his eyes, from the question in them that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with the undeniable pull between them. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just know that when I heard you'd been shot, nothing mattered except seeing for myself that you were still alive. And I don't understand that, because I've known you for such a short time and I should still be grieving Thomas. And Beatrice," he interrupted gently, his fingers tightening around hers. "Grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow rules or timetables. And feeling something for someone new doesn't diminish what you had with your husband." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Doesn't it? Sometimes it feels like a betrayal. Thomas would want you to live, wouldn't he, to find happiness again?" She nodded, a tear spilling over despite her efforts to contain it. "He told me that, actually, when he was dying. He made me promise not to shut myself away to keep living fully." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "And then I promptly broke that promise until you showed up and fixed my step." Franklin smiled, reaching up with his good hand to brush away her tear. "Sometimes we need a little help to keep our promises, even if it's just a repaired step to make the path forward a bit easier." The tenderness in his touch and his words broke something open inside her. Beatrice felt the walls she'd built around her heart since Thomas died beginning to crumble. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I should let you rest, she said, gently withdrawing her hand from his. The doctor says you need plenty of sleep to heal properly. Franklin nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Beatrice. Not until you want me to. The simple promise settled over her like a warm blanket. Good, she said softly, because I think I'm starting to get used to having you around. She left the room then, her heart racing as if she'd run a great distance. In a way, perhaps she had from the isolating depths of grief toward the possibility of something new. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in months, Beatrice felt as if she was moving forward rather than simply existing in the shadow of loss. Over the next week, Franklin's strength returned steadily. By the end of the second week, he was able to move around the house with minimal discomfort, though his left arm remained in a sling to protect his healing shoulder. Dr. Wilson was pleased with his progress and reduced his visits to every other day. Beatrice found herself enjoying Franklin's company more than she could have imagined. He was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry wit that often made her laugh unexpectedly. In the evenings, after she closed the store, they would sit in her small parlor, talking about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd traveled, childhood memories. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Franklin asked about her paintings again. Have you thought about picking up a brush? The light in the valley has been extraordinary lately, especially at sunset. Beatrice glanced toward her easel, which still stood unused in the corner of the room. I've thought about it, she admitted. But each time I consider it, something holds me back. Fear that it won't bring the same joy, he suggested gently. She nodded, surprised by his perception. That and a sense that moving forward with anything I once enjoyed feels like leaving Thomas behind. Franklin was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. When I lost Sarah and little Emma, I couldn't bear to hear music for almost a year. Sarah played the piano, you see, and Emma was just learning. Our house was always filled with music. He stared into the fire, his eyes distant with memory. One day I was in a saloon in Santa Fe, just passing through when a girl started playing a tune Sarah used to love. I nearly walked out, but something made me stay. And as I listened, I realized that the music wasn't painful anymore. It had become a way of remembering them, of keeping them with me. Beatrice understood what he was saying. You think painting could be like that for me, a way of carrying Thomas forward rather than leaving him behind. I think, Franklin said carefully, that the greatest tribute to those we've loved and lost is to live fully in their absence, to find joy again, to create beauty, to connect with others, not despite our grief but alongside it. His words resonated deeply within her. For months, she had equated honoring Thomas's memory with suffering, as if her pain was the measure of her love for him. But what if the opposite was true? What if the best way to honor him was to embrace life again, to reclaim the parts of herself that had brought her joy? Perhaps I'll try tomorrow, she said, her gaze returning to the easel. If the light is as beautiful as you say. Franklin smiled, the firelight catching in his eyes. I'll carry your supplies if you'd like company. My right arm works just fine. The next afternoon, true to their plan, Beatrice closed the store early. Franklin helped her gather her painting supplies, and together they walked to the edge of town, finding a spot on a small rise that offered a view of Eureka with the mountains beyond. As Beatrice set up her easel and prepared her paints, she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. It had been so long since she'd done this, and she worried that her skills might have abandoned her along with her faith. Franklin seemed to sense her apprehension. Just start, he said gently. Don't worry about the result. Just make the first stroke and see where it leads you. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice dipped her brush into the paint and touched it to the canvas. The familiar sensation of bristles against fabric sent a shock of recognition through her, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. She made another stroke, and another, her hand remembering what her mind had tried to forget. Franklin sat nearby, his back against a tree, watching her work with an expression of quiet admiration. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the valley was bathed in golden light, transforming the ordinary landscape into something magical. Beatrice lost herself in the process, the world narrowing to just her, the canvas, and the interplay of light and shadow before her. She painted with an intensity she hadn't felt in months, perhaps years, capturing not just the physical landscape, but the feeling it evoked, a sense of space and possibility, of beauty emerging from the ordinary. When she finally stepped back from the canvas, the sun was setting, and Franklin had built a small fire to ward off the evening chill. She looked at what she had created, not her most technically perfect work, perhaps, but alive with emotion and light in a way her earlier paintings had never been. "It's beautiful," Franklin said, coming to stand beside her. "You've captured something essential about this place." "Thank you," she said softly, surprised to find tears in her eyes, "for suggesting this, for making me remember who I was before grief became my only identity." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years. "The grief doesn't define you, Beatrice. It's just one part of your story." In that moment, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, with the warmth of Franklin's hand in hers, Beatrice felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. Not the naive hope of youth that believed bad things wouldn't happen, but a deeper, more resilient hope that knew suffering was part of life, but not its entirety. They stayed until the last light faded from the sky, talking quietly as stars appeared overhead. When they finally gathered her supplies and headed back to town, Beatrice felt lighter than she had in months, as if she had set down a burden she'd been carrying for too long. At her door, Franklin hesitated. Though he had been staying in her spare room during his recovery, tonight felt different somehow, more charged with unspoken possibilities. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "Watching you paint was like witnessing someone come back to life." Beatrice looked up at him, acutely aware of his presence, of the scant inches between them. "Perhaps that's what happened," she whispered. "Perhaps I needed to remember that beauty still exists, even after so much pain." Franklin reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "Beatrice," he said, her name a question and a plea all at once. She knew what he was asking, knew that they stood on the precipice of something that would change everything. Part of her wanted to retreat, to cling to the safe familiarity of her grief and isolation. But another part, growing stronger by the day, yearned to step forward into the unknown. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Of what?" "Of feeling again. Of caring for someone who might also be taken from me. Of betraying Thomas's memory." Franklin's eyes held hers steadily. "I can't promise that pain won't come again. No one can. But I can promise to face whatever comes alongside you for as long as you'll allow me to." His thumb brushed gently over her cheekbone. "As for Thomas, loving again doesn't erase what you shared with him. The heart has an infinite capacity for love. It's not a zero-sum game." His words washed over her like a benediction, releasing her from a guilt she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. With trembling fingers, Beatrice reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his lips. "When you were shot," she said softly, "I realized that I had started to care for you in a way I never expected to care for anyone again, and it terrified me. "And now?" Franklin asked, his hand covering hers against his cheek. "Now I'm still terrified," she admitted with a small smile. "But I'm beginning to think that some risks are worth taking." He leaned forward then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Beatrice didn't move, her heart pounding as his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was almost reverent. It was brief, a whisper of contact that ended almost before it began, but it sent a cascade of warmth through her body. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers for any sign of regret or discomfort. Instead, he found wonder and a tentative joy that mirrored his own. "I should go in," Beatrice said, though she made no move to release his hand. "It's getting late." Franklin nodded, understanding that she needed time to process what had just happened between them. "Will you paint again tomorrow?" "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I think I will," he smiled, lifting her hand to his lips for a brief kiss before releasing it. "Then I'll see you in the morning." Beatrice watched him walk toward the hotel where he had taken a room the previous day, now that he was well enough to move about on his own. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, and her heart felt simultaneously lighter and fuller than it had in months. Inside her small house, she moved to place her painting on the mantel, stepping back to study it in the lamplight. It wasn't just a landscape, she realized. It was a statement of faith not in God or some grand divine plan, but in the possibility of finding beauty and meaning even after devastating loss. As she prepared for bed that night, Beatrice found herself thinking of Franklin's words from their first dinner together. He had said that some days, appreciating a sunset or helping a neighbor or enjoying a good meal had to be enough. At the time, it had seemed like settling for less, like abandoning the grander faith she had once held. Now she understood that it wasn't settling at all, it was recognizing the sacred in the everyday, finding transcendence not beyond this world but within it, in moments of connection and creation, and simple human kindness. It wasn't the faith of her childhood, with its certainties and promises of divine protection. It was something more tentative, but perhaps more honest, a willingness to remain open to beauty and love even knowing their fragility, even knowing that loss might come again. As she drifted toward sleep, Beatrice found herself whispering words she hadn't spoken in months, words that felt both familiar and entirely new. "Thank you." Not directed at a God she no longer understood, but at life itself, at the mysterious forces that had brought Franklin Pierce to her door on a rainy afternoon when she had thought herself beyond reaching. The following weeks brought a gentle transformation to Beatrice's life. She painted nearly every day, sometimes with Franklin beside her, sometimes alone. The store prospered as she found renewed energy for running it, implementing ideas Thomas had discussed, but never acted upon, expanding the inventory to include more household goods, offering credit to minors who were good for it, hosting occasional evening gatherings where folks could socialize while browsing merchandise. Franklin secured a permanent position with the stage line, not as a guard, but as a manager overseeing operations between Eureka and Crescent City. The role kept him in town most days, allowing him to call on Beatrice regularly. Though he maintained his room at the hotel for propriety's sake, they spent most evenings together, talking, rating, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. The people of Eureka noticed the change in the widow Lawson, of course. Some approved of her renewed engagement with life. Others whispered that she had moved on too quickly from her grief. Beatrice found, to her surprise, that she cared little for either opinion. She was learning to trust her own heart, to define her own timeline for healing. One evening in late summer, Franklin took her on a picnic to their favorite spot overlooking the valley. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of pine and late-blooming wildflowers. They ate the simple meal Beatrice had prepared: fried chicken, biscuits, and blackberry pie, and watched as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "I have something for you," Franklin said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, clearly handmade, with intricate carving on the lid, a landscape of mountains and valleys that resembled the view before them. "Did you make this?" Beatrice asked, running her fingers over the detailed work. He nodded. "While I was recovering. I worked on it a bit each day when you were minding the store." She opened the box to find a simple silver band nestled inside, unadorned but beautifully crafted. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked from the ring to Franklin's face. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he said quickly, reading the mixture of emotions in her eyes. "I know it's soon, and I know there are still days when grief overwhelms you. I just wanted you to know my intentions, to understand that what I feel for you isn't passing or casual." Beatrice closed the box gently, holding it in her palm as she gathered her thoughts. "Franklin, I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible after losing Thomas. But marriage, I don't know if I'm ready for that step." He covered her hand with his. "I understand. The box and what's inside are yours to keep, whether you ever wear the ring or not. There's no time frame, no pressure. I just wanted you to have a tangible reminder that someone in this world cherishes you, believes in you, and wants to build a life with you whenever you might be ready for that." Tears welled in her eyes at the simple perfection of his words, at the patience and understanding behind them. "How did you become so wise about grief and healing?" Franklin smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "The hard way, I'm afraid. After Sarah and Emma died, I made every mistake possible. I ran from my pain, tried to drown it in whiskey, lashed out at those who tried to help me. It took years before I understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting or moving on as if nothing happened. It means incorporating the loss into your life story and continuing to write new chapters." Beatrice leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I'm not ready to say yes," she whispered. "But I'm not saying no either. I'm asking for time." "Time you shall have," he replied softly. "As much as you need." They stayed on the hillside until stars appeared. Beatrice nestled against Franklin's chest as they named constellations and shared stories from their childhoods. The wooden box remained in her pocket, a promise and a possibility that warmed her heart even as she acknowledged her lingering uncertainty. When they returned to town, Franklin walked her to her door as always. Their goodnight kiss lasted longer than usual, filled with a new depth of emotion after the evening's exchange. As they pulled apart, Beatrice found herself reluctant to let him go. "Stay," she whispered, surprising herself with the boldness of the invitation. Franklin searched her face, making sure he understood her meaning. "Beatrice, are you certain? Your reputation in town is already the subject of gossip," she finished for him, "and I find I care less about that with each passing day." She took his hand, leading him inside. "I'm not ready for marriage yet, but I am ready to stop pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than love." The word hung between them, the first time either had spoken it aloud. Franklin's eyes widened slightly, then softened with emotion. "I love you too, Beatrice. Have since that first day in the rain, I think." That night, they crossed a threshold in their relationship, coming together with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. As Beatrice lay in Franklin's arms afterward, she felt a peace she had thought lost forever, not the naive peace of her youth, but something deeper and more hard-won. "When I lost my faith after Thomas died," she said softly, her fingers tracing patterns on Franklin's chest, "I thought I was doomed to wander in darkness forever. I couldn't understand why a loving God would allow such senseless violence, such devastating loss. Franklin pressed a kiss to her forehead, waiting for her to continue. "I still don't have those answers," she admitted. "But I've found something I didn't expect, that light can exist even without certainty, that love is possible even in a world where terrible things happen." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking into his eyes. "Do you remember what you said to me that day at the cemetery, when you found me raging at God?" He nodded, recalling the moment clearly. "I said, then believe in me for a while. I was offering to be your anchor until you found your own footing again." "You've been so much more than that," Beatrice said, touching his face tenderly. "You've been my companion, my confidant, my reason to get up each morning and face the day with courage rather than resignation." "And you've been my redemption," he replied. "After Sarah and Emma died, I thought I'd never have a home again, never belong anywhere or to anyone. You've given me back that sense of belonging, of purpose." They fell silent then, words giving way to touches and kisses as they reaffirmed their connection in the most intimate way possible. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window, Beatrice retrieved the wooden box from her discarded dress and opened it, the silver ring gleaming in the pale light. "I'm still not ready to wear this," she said honestly. "But I think the day is coming when I will be." Franklin pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And when that day comes, I'll be here. Until then, we have this, each moment as it unfolds, each day as it comes." "That's enough," Beatrice said, nestling into his embrace. "More than enough." As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Beatrice continued to flourish. Her paintings began attracting attention beyond Irica, with a merchant from San Francisco offering to sell them in his gallery. The general store thrived under her innovative management, becoming a gathering place for the community, rather than just a place of commerce. Franklin's work with the stage line expanded to include consulting on security measures throughout the region, his experience with bandits and road agents proving invaluable. Though he still traveled occasionally, Irica remained his home base specifically, the home he now openly shared with Beatrice. Convention be damned. The gossip about their arrangement flared briefly, then subsided as the townspeople adapted to the new normal. Some of the more rigid church members continued to snub Beatrice, but many others accepted the relationship, recognizing the positive change it had brought to a woman who had been drowning in grief. Beatrice still visited Thomas's grave regularly, but the nature of these visits evolved. Instead of angry recriminations directed at God or desperate pleas for the pain to stop, she would simply sit and talk to Thomas, telling him about her day, her work, her art. And yes, about Franklin, not with guilt, but with a gentle acknowledgement that life had continued as Thomas had wanted it to. One crisp October morning, Beatrice woke early, slipping out of bed without waking Franklin. She dressed quietly and made her way to the cemetery, frost crunching beneath her boots. The valley was shrouded in mist, the sun just beginning to burn through the eastern mountains. She settled on the small bench near Thomas's grave, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Good morning, Thomas," she said softly, as had become her custom. "The first frost came last night. You always loved this time of year." For a while, she sat in companionable silence, watching as the mist began to lift from the valley below. Then, reaching into her pocket, she withdrew the wooden box Franklin had given her months before. She opened it, the silver ring catching the early light. "I think I'm ready," she said, addressing both Thomas and the ring itself. "Not to forget you, never that, but to honor the promise I made when you were dying, to live fully and find joy again." With steady hands, she removed the ring from its velvet nest and slipped it onto the fourth finger of her left hand. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her, which, she realized, it probably had been. "I'll always love you, Thomas," she said, standing to trace her fingers over the letters of his name on the headstone. "But I've learned that the heart has room for more than one great love in a lifetime. Franklin taught me that." As she turned to leave, she noticed a figure standing at the cemetery gate. Franklin, watching her with understanding in his eyes. He had known where she would be this morning, had given her the space she needed for this private moment of transition. Beatrice walked toward him, her heart full of so many emotions: gratitude, love, a touch of lingering sadness, but most of all, hope. When she reached him, she held out her hand wordlessly, the ring gleaming on her finger. Franklin's face broke into a smile of such joy that it took her breath away. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke volumes without a single word. When he finally set her down, he took her face between his hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "As sure as I've ever been of anything," she replied, her own voice steady and clear. "I want to be your wife, Franklin Pierce. I want to build a life with you to face whatever comes together." He kissed her then, right there at the cemetery gate with the morning sun warming their faces, a kiss that tasted of promises kept and new beginnings. 3 weeks later, on a golden afternoon in late October, Beatrice Lawson became Beatrice Pierce in a simple ceremony held in their favorite spot overlooking the valley. Only a few close friends attended: Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Jenkins from the livery, and the young couple who had bought Thomas's general store from Beatrice the week before. Yes, she had decided to sell the store not out of defeat, as she might have a year ago, but as a conscious choice to focus on her art and her new life with Franklin. The proceeds from the sale, combined with Franklin's savings, had allowed them to purchase a small ranch just outside of Eureka, with ample room for his horses and a light-filled studio space for her painting. As they exchanged vows beneath the vast California sky, Beatrice felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle from the broken woman who had stood in the rain at Thomas's grave, raging against a God who seemed to have abandoned her. She still didn't have answers to the big questions that had haunted her after Thomas's death. She hadn't returned to church or reclaimed the unquestioning faith of her younger years. But she had found something perhaps more valuable: the courage to live fully in an uncertain world, to risk love again, despite knowing its potential cost, to find meaning and purpose even without cosmic guarantees. And when Franklin said, "I do," his voice strong and sure as he placed a simple gold band on her finger to join the silver one she already wore, Beatrice knew with bone-deep certainty that she had made the right choice. Not to replace what she had lost, but to honor it by continuing to grow, to love, to create beauty in a world that so often seemed bent on destruction. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of amber and rose, Franklin took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding band. "Happy?" he asked simply. Beatrice considered the question, her mind traveling back over the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the deepest grief to this quiet joy, from faithlessness to a different kind of belief. "Yes," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not in the simple way I might have been before I understood how fragile life is, but deeply happy, in a way that acknowledges the darkness but chooses to face toward the light." Franklin pressed a kiss to the top of her head, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's the best kind of happiness," he said softly. "The kind that's chosen, not just received." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Beatrice thought about the long journey ahead, the years they would share, the challenges they would face, the love that would continue to grow between them. She thought about the children they might have, the art she would create, the life they would build together on this patch of California earth. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she found herself looking forward to the future with genuine anticipation rather than dread. Not because she believed that everything would be perfect or that no more hardships would come, she knew better than that now, but because she had learned that it was possible to rebuild after devastating loss, to find meaning and purpose and, yes, even joy in the aftermath of heartbreak. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she confessed, watching as the first stars appeared. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of me had died with him." "And now?" Franklin asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Now I understand that grief and love can coexist. That moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past. That the heart is more resilient than I ever imagined." In the growing darkness, Franklin's face was illuminated only by the soft glow from the lamps inside their home. But Beatrice could see in his eyes everything she needed to know, that he understood her journey because he had walked a similar path, that he would continue to stand beside her through whatever lay ahead, that the love between them was both a shelter and a calling to live more fully in the world. "Then believe in me for a while," he had said all those months ago at the cemetery, offering himself as an anchor when her faith had failed her. She had taken that offer, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the days passed. Now, as the stars multiplied overhead and the night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, Beatrice realized that she had found her way back to a kind of faith after all. Not in an all-powerful God who controlled every aspect of human destiny, but in the resilience of the human spirit, in the healing power of love freely given and received, in the possibility of beauty emerging from the ashes of loss. And that, she decided as Franklin's lips found hers in the darkness, was enough to build a life on. More than enough.